Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. How are you? This is our summer series. That's why it's a little bit light here today of Grand Rounds, but we do expect more people to come. And thank you so much for being here today for really the final series of our summer Grand Rounds around care of the agitated and aggressive patient. And it gives me great pleasure in a minute to introduce our speaker here and our presenter. Just a little bit of a background, I think. As many of you know, it was really earlier this spring when we really had identified here at Children's this huge increase in how, in the agitated and aggressive patient that was coming into our emergency department, that the increased aggression that we were seeing in our inpatient units and also in our adolescent psych unit and child psych unit. As a result of that, excuse me, as a result of that, Dr. Newman really charged the team to take a look at this in a very, very different way. So myself, with Dr. Cora Bramble, with Tanya Kinlow, and many, many others, Roger, who's here, Dr. Packer, who's here, we took a step back and said, have a really broad brush approach. We have an external focus in which we're working with the Metropolitan Police Department, Department of Behavioral Mental Health, the Department of Health, working on strategies from that perspective. Dr. Newman has met with Chief Lanier, and I want to recognize Lieutenant Augustine, who's here today from the police department. We've done a lot of work from that perspective, working with Dr. Joshi and many, many others. We also then have an internal approach and a strategy that's led by Linda Talley and Martha Pera, looking at how do we manage the patients once they come into our organization and we need to quickly de-escalate situations. So part of this summer series has been a four-part educational opportunity for our entire organization. At the beginning of the summer, we learned from Dr. Cohen about the growing rise and increase of substance abuse, and my goodness, what's out there and is available for the kids and the synthetics, and how do we manage those kids once they come into our emergency department or they're in our clinical or medical units. We learned from Reggie Bannerman and Dr. Joshi, who just also gave a fantastic grand rounds on the manifestations of psychiatric illness and what this means for us and how do we manage and how do we de-escalate situations. 2 weeks ago, we learned from Dr. Beers, again, another fantastic summer series around trauma-informed care and how do we do trauma-informed assessments, and not from the sense of the kids who are coming in and our trauma team responds, but in a very, very different way. So we learned about new strategies and techniques there. And today, it gives me great privilege and pleasure to have invited in Dr. Dyann Daley from Cook Children's Hospital in Texas. And let me tell you how this started is that Dr. Newman was at a CEO Chiefs meeting earlier this year in May and heard Rick Merrill, the CEO at Cook Children's, speak on this very topic that Dr. Daley is going to talk about today. And it sparked a whole level of interest on our side around how we can perhaps either be a part of the great work that you're doing in the community and start to think about some of the challenges we have in a different way. So let me tell you a little bit about our presenter today. Dr. Dyann Daley, she's a pediatric anesthesiologist. Yes, a surprise in this field, which is fantastic, and we talked a little bit about how the uniqueness of being an anesthesiologist and looking at this problem in a very different way outside of the walls of an OR. She's at Cook Children's Hospital, or Cook Children's Medical Center. She's been there for 9 years. She received her medical degree from Saba University School of Medicine in the Netherlands before completing her anesthesiology residency at Baylor College of Medicine and her pediatric anesthesiology fellowship at UT Southwestern. In addition to being a pediatric anesthesiologist, Dr. Daley has co-founded the Center for Prevention of Child Maltreatment in 2014 and is the executive director of that center. The Center for Prevention of Child Maltreatment at Cook Children's has innovatively used risk terrain modeling and criminology risk analysis data to drive their program and predict specific areas where child maltreatment will occur in certain areas of the city and leverages the use of consumer analytics to effectively target appropriate resources based on demographic profiling. Dr. Daley is heading up several coordinated initiatives in the center, including a citywide collaborative for safe infant sleep, early detection of child maltreatment training, foster and adoption family recruitment, and survivor resiliency social media campaign. And she's also here in Washington to meet with some national leaders around this very topic, and has a statewide initiative in Texas. And as we all know, Texas is not a state, it's its own country. And so she's really driving that. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Daley.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. It is such an honor to be here, and I promise that me being a pediatric anesthesiologist will make sense in the near future. So it's actually a sad story, which makes sense once you hear it. So this is a picture of my son, and it was taken about a week after the case that changed my career. So he's my second child, and when I went back to work after having my babies, I saw so many child abuse fatalities come through the OR. In the year when this picture was taken, there were 7 physical child abuse fatalities that came through our hospital, and 6 of them came in when I was on call. And so there was 1 that died in the operating room with me, which was essentially a grade 5 liver laceration from a child that had been drop kicked by his father. And so, but everyone thought it was a head injury at first, and so when we got into the OR and they opened him up and he exsanguinated, that was a terrible 40 minutes or so of coding and trying to resuscitate, you can imagine. And so that little boy was about the same age as my son, and when I was sitting there with him, helping him, trying to help him, and watching him die, I couldn't help but think about what it would have been like for my son to be in the same circumstance and to be looking for comfort from the person that was killing him. And I promised that baby in that moment that I would do something to try to get in between children like him and the people that were hurting them. Now, I had no idea what I was going to do, but it all started with learning about that case. So what I figured out soon after that was that children that come in and die from child maltreatment typically have signs of child maltreatment that are missed in the medical setting. And I know you guys have heard a lot about that with sentinel injuries probably. So the sentinel injuries are the very small injuries that we look for that precede either fatal or very damaging physical abuse. These are all children that went on to experience either fatal or significant trauma. So the very first thing we did, I went to the administration and I was like, you know, as an anesthesiologist, we didn't learn a lot about this kind of stuff in school, so I just want to make a 15-minute training. This all started with just making a 15-minute training, right, about child maltreatment. And as we started to talk with people and let people know about what you can do about child maltreatment and what you should be looking for, all of a sudden there was more interest. And as that project grew, it grew into the rest of the center. So I'm going to kind of go through the progression of how it happened and what we found along the way. So the first thing that we created was a training. It turned out to be about 2 hours long, and it has a simulation at the beginning. So it's like a little video game where you can test your skills. Not only do you know what to look for in a child that comes in and has features suspicious of child maltreatment, but do you know what to order? Do you know what questions to ask? That sort of thing. You get to examine the baby. And then there's also, you know, lots of other content. What we found in rolling this out across our hospital system was that most people that took the training had a significant increase in their level of knowledge across a variety of different topics about child maltreatment, including people that had worked in child maltreatment in emergency rooms. So we were very excited about that. So it's free, and about, I don't know, 2,500 people now inside of our system have taken it. And we found that there is a statistically significant increase in likelihood of reporting suspicion across 9 of 9 suspicious scenarios in this training. So this is just the first part, which is why I mention it. And it's available on our website right here if anyone wants to check it out. So as we were creating this training, there was a lot of learning along the way. And this was the first time that I had ever really heard about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Now, how many of you guys have heard about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study? That's about right. So in the training, we asked that question, how many of you have heard about this study, and about 6% of participants have heard about it. So what this study is Vince Felitti, Kaiser Permanente, and the CDC did a study about 20 years ago looking at how early childhood adversity affects lifelong health. And what they found is that if a child experiences 4 or more either maltreatment, abuse-related, neglect-related, or socially or family problems, really, mental illness in the home, divorce in the home, if they experience 4 or more of those things, they have their health changes for their entire life. And we'll talk about that, why that happens now. So to change, the pathophysiology associated with toxic stress really begins with fear. So all a child has to do is experience fear over and over and over again, and it changes the way that they develop. So if you're a child and you're in a circumstance where there's something really scary, you have 3 options. You can fight, flight, or freeze. Now, we're all familiar with the fight response. It looks like this, or like this in a child. There's the flight response, which looks like this, or could look like this in a child. And then there's the freeze response, and I'm sorry for this picture, it's a terrible picture. So this bunny is frozen. He's clearly still alive, but he's not trying to get away anymore. So what's happening here is we've gone past the ability to fight or flight, and it makes the most sense from a survival standpoint for the bunny not to do anything. The parasympathetic nervous system is going to kick up. The brain is going to flood with dopamine. Heart rate is going to drop. These things are important because if you're injured, you're not going to bleed to death as easily in this type of circumstance. And you detach from the situation. You become dissociated. And so this is something that children that are maltreated experience as well. And we all know the story about Adrian Peterson. Do you guys remember that story when he took the branch and caned his son? So he said in an interview that he expressed regret that his son did not cry because then he would have known that the switch was doing more harm than he intended. But this is a freeze response because this is the actual damage that was done to this child. So he had these tiger stripes, cuts and bruises all the way up the front and back of his legs, even on his scrotum, but he didn't cry because it wasn't going to help him. He was frozen. Another example of this type of circumstance is with Elizabeth Smart. She was abducted from her home when she was 14 years old and held captive by these 2 people. She was chained up, starved, raped every day, beaten. Every terrible thing you can imagine happened to this girl. And after a while, they started taking her out in public. And when she was finally recovered 9 months later, people would look at this picture, and that's her there, and her captor is on the right. And they would say, well, you must have been in on this. You must have wanted to be there, because why didn't you try to get away when you were in this party setting? And I've spoken with her personally, and she says that she had gotten to the point where every day she was so traumatized that she felt like she was an egg, and that she had this shell around her, and that shell was protecting what was inside, and she couldn't even in this circumstance try to get out of that shell, because if she did, she thought that things would get worse. And so that's another example of what it looks like to be frozen. So children that are in abusive environments or in environments where they have a lot of adversity, they're going through this fight, flight, freeze response over and over and over again, sometimes multiple times during a day. And we all understand intuitively that the things that you exercise get stronger, right? So if you take a child that has in a low emotional state versus a child in a high emotional state or in a more toxic state, the different parts of their brain are going to adapt to what they are needing to do all of the time. So if you're in survival mode all the time, you're actually going to grow more connections from your fear center to other parts of your brain. And you're not going to develop the parts of your brain that are involved with things like executive functioning, decision-making, even being able to think long-term about consequences to action. And you can even see this if you look at scans. So this is a famous scan from, I think, well, the CDC put it out. I can't remember which paper it came out of, but what it shows here is a normal brain on the left. Front of the brain is on the top, back of the brain is on the bottom. And on the right, you have the brain of a 3-year-old Romanian orphan who was essentially neglected his entire life. So you can see that there's a difference in both volume and activity in multiple parts of the brain here. Now, the reason that that happens is because the parts of your brain that you don't need, you're not going to develop them as fully. So in this child, or in a lot of these children that we hear about that come over from these orphanages, they never really learn how to talk or how to walk or how to do a lot of the social or emotional things that we are all accustomed to. And the reason they don't is because they never had to. They never had to develop that part of their brain. And once someone is over 5 years old, it's going to be a lot harder to go back and change that. So if you imagine a child also that has deficiency, maybe not deficiencies, but differences in how their frontal lobe is connected to both their fear center and to other parts. They're going to have trouble with attention. And this is the reason why children that are experiencing maltreatment are, the diagnosis they're most likely to have that is a misdiagnosis is ADHD. But it makes sense based on the physiology. So if you think about this, you've got a child that is chronically stressed all the time, and they're in an environment where they can't get away, they can't take care of themselves. They're overgrowing the fear center of their brain and becoming more reactive and more responsive to threats in their environment, while also not developing the part of their brain that helps them to know, hey, you're going to be okay, you know, calm down, that was just a loud noise. So as you can imagine, these kids are going to grow up and they're going to have trouble with mental illness. They're going to be trying to cope with the feelings that they're having based on their neurophysiology, and they're going to do things like smoke. They're going to do things like overeat. They're going to drink. They're going to use drugs. There's even one study that shows that children that grow up in this environment actually have an increased pleasure response to methamphetamine. So some of these things that people are doing that we see as the problem are really just a sign of something that is more significant. Other things that kids will do when they grow up in these environments is be a lot more sexually promiscuous. Again, it's going to change the way that they feel. It's going to make them feel a little bit better. But of course, this activity is going to increase their likelihood of having sexually transmitted infections, more likely to have abortions, teen pregnancy. And of course, if a girl doesn't finish school, then that's going to exacerbate the problem of poverty. So other things that happen is these children, as they go through the fight, flight, or freeze response, they come to be more comfortable in a detached state because that's where they can survive in this terrible moment. And so these kids are going to be more isolated, which makes them more vulnerable to predators in their community. They're also going to look for ways to dissociate. So this is the kid that you can't get off their video game. Or, I mean, we've all done Netflix marathons, but the people that you can't get away from Netflix. Or let's say you have a patient like this. I mean, I know that we all see patients like this. And a lot of times we'll be like, she just doesn't even care about her baby, but that might not be the circumstance. They might be detaching from something that feels traumatic to them. Other things that children will do, which is common among children that have this pathophysiology, is they'll be involved in things like truancy, risk-taking behavior. Again, that's going to change the way that they feel. They might also be more likely to do things like body modification or cutting. And the reason for this is that when you are inflicting pain, not only are they going to have an increased responsiveness to this opiate release, right, endogenous opioids, but they're also going to immediately dissociate. The pain causes them to go into a dissociative state. So again, this isn't the problem. This is a symptom of the problem. Eating disorders are also more common, probably for similar reasons. Children that grow up in these environments are more likely to be involved in violent crimes and gangs, to commit crimes. And of course, all of these things together add up to a child that's in a lot of trouble, and they're going to be in poverty. And that is going to be one of the things that then furthers these problems to the next generation. Also more likely to be in prison. And adult outcomes also include things like increased likelihood of being homeless, of being a perpetrator or victim of domestic violence, much higher likelihood of committing suicide, and we even found that they're more likely to experience both premature birth and death, infant mortality. So we've known this for a little while. You know, in pediatrics, we've been talking about the adverse effects of early childhood toxic stress for a while. And there, in addition to these social and emotional problems I've mentioned, we know for sure that adverse childhood experiences, 4 or more in early childhood, have a clear link to obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, asthma, autoimmune diseases, some cancers, and then these things that we just talked about, which are all, of course, risk factors for becoming a perpetrator of child maltreatment in adulthood. So this is where the problem really is. So this is at the crux of the problem. The children that are at highest risk for both being abused or neglected and also for being killed by abuse or neglect are age 0 to 3. In Texas, those children, if they are noticed and they enter the system, there's a 20% recurrence rate after their return to their family, which means that if you're looking at the 0 to 5 population, which is when 90% of your brain development occurs, you're burning that entire developmental window with early childhood adversity. So we have to get to these kids before they hit age 5, and their window for recovery is not gone, but diminished. So how do you do that? So that's a long story to say, with the little boy that I had in the operating room, how do you even find that kid before he shows up in the operating room with terrible injuries or with some fatal injury? And this is something that's actually a pretty big problem. So the three types of people that are most likely to report suspicion of child maltreatment are medical providers, teachers, and law enforcement. But if you think about the 0 to 3 age group, they're not in school to be noticed by school personnel. They may not be seeking primary care, and if law enforcement is involved, there's already a problem. So the typical reporting system that captures the children that are older probably isn't going to work on these younger kids. So the American Academy of Pediatrics has been really focused on having a pediatrician screen for adverse childhood experiences. It's a 7-question questionnaire. It's free. It's online. It's at aces2high.com if you guys want to go there and check it out. But an issue with this initiative is that the majority of pediatricians, they did a survey looking at pediatricians, less than 11% of pediatricians really know about the ACEs study. They don't know about the pathophysiology associated with early childhood stress, and only about 4% of them actually screen for adversity. So this is a problem. But there's also an assumption that these children are receiving primary care and that screening in the primary care arena is the right place to be. So at Cook Children's, we have a homeless initiative where we capture children when they're in a number of the different homeless and women's shelters in Fort Worth, bring them into the system, and then we followed them longitudinally over, I think it's been 7 years now, the slide is a little bit older, to see where do these children that we know have risk factors for child maltreatment, where do they interact with medical care inside of our own system. And what we found is that while we try to get them to go to primary care, the place that they go most commonly is the emergency room and urgent care, which isn't a surprise to anyone. But the second most common place that they were intercepted in the hospital was in specialty clinics. So if only 11% of pediatricians are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, I'm pretty sure that most specialists probably are not aware. And we did find that in that training that I showed you guys at the very beginning. So we looked at across provider types, across different roles in the hospital, who knows about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and it was about 6% of people that knew about it. And the problem here is that this is not a topic that we study or that is tested on the USMLE or on the NCLEX, which is for nurses. So before we really approach mass screening, we need to make sure that we're educating our students is the way to solve that. So what I learned from this was that, okay, this isn't going to be a way to find these kids. So what else can we do? So then we started looking at predictive analytics. Now, usually when I start talking about predictive analytics, the first idea that pops into people's head is like Minority Report. There's even been an article about the work that we do where they actually referenced Minority Report. This is not what we're doing at all. Minority Report was kind of the concept of the 1990s predictive policing, where you were profiling an individual based on their characteristics and maybe trying to punish them or reform them before they actually do something wrong. So it's this kind of concept. This guy says he's about to get randomly selected, right? Now, everyone's uncomfortable with this, and so I want you to know that this is not the focus of the type of predictive analytics that we're doing. So we found a guy named Joel Kaplan at Rutgers University who he developed, and he's a partner on this project now, a technique called risk terrain modeling for criminology, really. They developed this to try to figure out how to prevent shootings in convenience stores by figuring out, and other projects as well, by figuring out the context in which the crime occurs so that then you can alter the context and prevent the crime. So it's a location-based predictive analytics. So just to give you an example, if you're looking for children that are playing, where are you going to look? You're going to look at a playground. If you're looking for people that are drinking, you're going to look in a bar, right? So you know where to find people that are exhibiting certain behaviors based on where they are. Now, some people use this same kind of idea to advance their sales ability. So think about this girl that sold Girl Scout cookies outside of a dispensary. This is a location-based way to predict whether or not you're going to have good sales, right? Or on a much sadder note, if you think about the way that rape typically occurs on campus, we know that it's freshmen and sophomores in their first month of school after they go to big raging parties where they have jungle juice that's spiked with Everclear. They don't know what's in it, they get too drunk, and then they end up in that circumstance. So there are certain things that you can figure out based on location. So what this technique is really all about is taking a dangerous situation and instead of focusing on, in this picture, what is the woman wearing? What did she drink? Was she flirting with a guy in the bar? We're not even talking about the woman. We're talking about the alley. What can you do to change the alley to make it safe for this woman to walk down? So we took the concept of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study and flipped it on its head. Instead of looking for individual children and families that have these factors, we decided to look at where do these factors overlap geographically using risk terrain modeling. So what you do is you take whatever the shapefile is of the study that or the area that you're studying, and you make individual layers of risk factor maps. So for child maltreatment, we really had to go to crime, because if you're looking for either proxies for or actual risk factors, you have to, for location-based predictive analytics, you have to have address-level data, and there's only a few places you can get that. So if you're looking for things like drug arrests, domestic violence, murder, aggravated assault, these are all things that you can put on a map. And so what risk terrain modeling does is you take the address of a drug arrest, for example, you put that on the map. You assign a sphere of influence around it in half-block increments up to 3 blocks, and then what the software does is it compares all of these different contextual risk factors against your dependent variable, which in this case was substantiated child maltreatment, and then it comes up with a forecast that tells you where child maltreatment is likely to occur in the future based on the contextual risk factors that were in the model that was optimized. So this is a shapefile of the city of Fort Worth, and what you see here is essentially a forecast of where we thought child abuse would occur in the future. So using only 2013 data, this is where we predicted, and the dark areas, the very dark areas, is where the risk is the highest. So using 2013 data only, this was the forecast, and in 2014, this is where substantiated child maltreatment cases occurred in the city of Fort Worth. We captured 98% of them. Not who, but where. So for age 0 to 17 years old, these were the factors that were most significant. Now, we're doing a second model right now. We're validating this model, and we're also creating a model that does not include poverty information, which we had to purchase from a consumer analytics company because you can't get it otherwise at an address level. And it still works without poverty, which I think is a very important distinction. Now, if you were looking at just those very high-risk areas, the risk inside of those clusters is 150 times higher, to those children, is 150 times higher than baseline, and we captured more than half of the children in 10% of the study area. Now, for children 0 to 3, the most important factors are domestic violence, and I think the relative risk on that one was in the 7, so far and above the most important contextual risk factor, followed by the presence of a runaway, meaning that the police picked up a runaway and took them back to an address, low household income, again from census data that we purchased through a consumer analytics company, aggravated assault, and murder. So first, we were like, oh my God, this actually works. I can't believe it worked, you know, especially coming into this circumstance as a pediatric anesthesiologist, we were surprised. Everyone's super excited, but then people are very quick to say, yeah, that's great and all, but one does not simply prevent child maltreatment. And it's true. If you look at 2014, there were 3 papers that came out that looked at child maltreatment prevention globally over the last 20 years. And I can send these to you if you want to read them more thoroughly. But essentially what they found in trying to figure out what actually works for primary prevention or just prevention of child maltreatment is there's nothing that works for sure. There are 3 programs that might work. There's nurse-family partnership, there's triple P parenting, and period of purple crying. But all 3 of them, they have very small effects, and they're not consistent or necessarily reproducible. So I know that that's probably different than what a lot of people have heard, but if you look at the studies that say that they are very successful, you always have to go back to how do you know? And I think that that's something that as a medical community, we're going to be, that's part of what makes it important for us to be involved in this, because we're the ones that are going to ask, how do you know that? How do you know that it's true? There was one program that I won't say what the name of it was that everyone is lauding as it prevents child maltreatment in 95% of the cases, but when you go to look to see how do you know that, they asked the parent in this court-mandated training, how often do you severely beat your child? Then they did the training, and then they asked the parent, how often do you severely beat your child? And if they give you, less, then they say, oh, 95% success, done, right? But many of the prevention programs that are out there are like that. So whenever you hear someone talking about a prevention program, just make sure you ask, how do you know, until you get all the way down to the question. So now we know where, and we know what to focus on, but we don't really have programs that we know are going to be effective contextually to prevent child maltreatment. So what can we do? So we took the forecast from the city of Fort Worth and we broke it down to just those highest risk cluster areas, and then found block groups, which are areas of about 250 households that are at least 80% covered by the highest risk areas. So we know the children in these particular block groups are in more trouble than the kids in the surrounding areas. And then we found out all kinds of stuff about those environments. Where are the churches? Where are the schools? Where are the faith communities? Where are the bus stops, dental care, community centers, fire departments, anything we could find that is a potential point of entry for prevention programming. We called every single one, and in almost every case, there wasn't any prevention programming being offered in these particular areas, which makes sense because if you think about prevention funding, in our area, in our county, we have a county of about 2 million people, and there's 200 nurse-family partnership slots. So how are they going to know where to focus that? If not, sorry about that, I don't know what's going on there. If they don't have information like this. So part of the value of figuring out very specifically geographically where you need to focus is you can find targets for insertion of prevention, and you can also start to define capacity for need, right? So people often will focus on building resilience. I show you this picture because, oh, it's not up there. Now it is, but now I can't see it. That's right. So I was there's this project in a very poor area of town in one of these risk cluster areas that I went to, and there was a little girl laying, actually there were 2 little girls laying on a bed just like this in a room just this dirty. And they have been offered prevention services before, but what will happen is people will go into this household and offer parenting classes. And I want you to think about the context in which this child is living. So if they're living in a place where you have domestic violence arrests, substance or drug arrests, murder, aggravated assault, and extreme poverty in the same 1 block area, they don't need parenting classes. They need to have an environment that's safer. You're never going to build resilience in a situation where you can't even leave your house. So a lot of these kids will end up kind of living in their house. They can't leave and go outside for the first many years of their life, the first 0 to 4 years, 0 to 5 years before they get into kindergarten. And that's part of the reason why they don't have the same sort of language development and educational development, neurodevelopment, because they don't have the interactions with people that are necessary to build that part of their brain because their environment isn't safe enough for them to be able to do that. Stand by. I don't know what is happening now. I might need technical assistance. Oh, wait, no, I don't. Okay. So working on making the environment safer. Now, this is also going to be important for substance abuse reduction. Have you guys ever heard about the rat park study? So somebody made it into a comic strip, which I thought was really cool. But essentially what they did is they took 2 groups of rats. They isolated one group in cages by themselves. The other group they put into Rat Park, which is where they had all their friends and they had stuff to play with and a nice environment. They gave both of them morphine, freely available morphine. The rats that were isolated would pretty much drink it until they died. The ones in Rat Park would just occasionally use it. So it wasn't something that became habitual or that damaged their health. And there have been some people that have taken the same approach, looking at increasing community around people to reduce drug abuse. So if we want to affect some of the symptoms that we're focused on for risk factors for child maltreatment, we need to work on community. So one of the programs that we are adapting and bringing into our high-risk environments is a program called Cure Violence. Now, this was originally developed by a guy named Gary Slutkin, and it's been out for about 20 years. And what it is it's a program where you hire people from high-risk communities, you train them, and then they go back into the area as violence interrupters. And they've had incredible results in reducing gang violence and gun violence. I mean, as much as within 2 years, decreasing violence by 70-some%. So this is one of the few programs that we could find that has objective, measurable outcomes. And we are working with them right now to adapt this model to domestic violence and child maltreatment. So we're going to hire people from these high-risk areas, train them, and so that they can then go back in to start changing the social norms around violence in their community. We're also doing big health, or they're not really health fairs, but they're more events in the communities. So, for example, there was that, the projects where those twin girls were on the bed. Right across the street from there is a park that has a beautiful playground that no one can ever go in because that's where all the drug dealers hang out. So what we've been doing is going there and having events with the police officers, with service providers in the community, and doing things like having, DJs and dancing and face painting and food. Like the police, they'll man the grill and they'll hand out burgers and hot dogs to people all day so that the people that are living in these very dangerous environments can get to know each other. They can come out of their house. They can interact with the police in a positive way. And then also at these events, we're providing health care, not referrals to health care, but actual health care. And we didn't think that people would want to do things like, blood pressure checks or HIV screening, but every type of health care we bring to these communities, they do it right there. They're maxed out all day, every day. So we're doing a series of these events to try to develop community so that resilience can begin to be built into these communities. We've also done things like figured out where the elementary schools are so that we can implement one of the only other programs we found that has objective outcome measures, RAD Kids, which is a program where kids practice fighting off predators, essentially. Like you put a guy in a big padded suit and then they practice fighting him off and saying no and running away and making sure that they're standing near where the cameras are if they're in a store, something like that, a way for them to get attention for themselves, stand up for themselves, and to practice it so that if they're in a dangerous environment, they kind of have some muscle memory about what to do. We've also figured out where all of the places of worship are, and these are great opportunities for prevention programming, including things like Darkness to Light training, Stewards of Children. This is Darkness to Light. They offer this training online and they also do it in person. But the thing that I like about this training is that they teach you how to engineer your interior environment to prevent sexual abuse from happening. So if you don't have, if you make sure that you don't have an office where the youth pastor is completely alone with the windows covered and a lock on the door, there's going to be a less likelihood that they're going to be able to sexually abuse children in that environment. So this training kind of goes through how to change the environment internally to prevent sexual abuse. We also looked at where things like licensed child care are located in relationship to the high-risk areas. And this is something that is actually a primary prevention opportunity, location of child care. So this is a picture of bus routes. And up in the left-hand corner, you can see that this is one of the risk cluster areas. The purple stars are bus stops. The blue dots are existing licensed child care facilities, and the yellow dots are places where there is existing infrastructure where you could place a child care center that's on the bus route that can actually be accessed by the women that live in this area. And the reason I say that this is a prevention option is whenever you see a kid come in with abusive head trauma, 9 times out of 10, it's the boyfriend that's taking care of the baby that they're not bonded with while the mom is at work. So infrastructure development around this sort of thing is also something that we can do for prevention. I've also looked at things like very high crime locations in these high-risk areas, very high violent crime locations, and you can do things like crime prevention through environmental design. So if there's a place where they keep getting robbed or there's a lot of drug dealing going on, if you increase line of sight, put cameras there, make sure that the police are aware of those areas, which they typically are anyway, you can improve the safety of those locations. You can also shut down the car washes or where the drug deals are happening, or the hotels or motels where prostitution is occurring through code enforcement. Unfortunately, all of these things are in different departments, which makes the coordination of activity important, and we'll get to that part in just a second. Also, if we know where the medical clinics are, we can start to figure out what sort of well-woman and pregnancy care women can get, and offer things like very effective birth control methods to help girls that are young actually avoid pregnancy reliably so that they can finish school. Also, looking across the different risk cluster areas, we see that the type of maltreatment is different depending on where you are in the city, which allows for a more focused approach to the type of messaging that you're delivering in those particular areas. So the area on the right here, 31% substantiated physical abuse. Nationally, it should be like 10%. So we're way overrepresented for physical abuse in this area, and this is also where a lot of the physical abuse deaths come from. So if we know that, we can work on changing the behaviors that lead up to that issue. And this is where people usually say, well, we can't change that behavior because it's a cultural thing. In social sciences, people will get into very complex theories of change, and you probably have gone to committee meetings about this and talked with people about this, but I think that there's a simpler way to look at this issue. How do we talk women into buying a $50,000 bag? Because we do it all the time. How do companies do this? Well, the way that they do this is they figure out who has bought that bag in the past, and then based on their other preferences or their psychographic profile, they can figure out where other women live that are going to be likely to make the same choices. So we're working with a company called Buxton, which is located in the Fort Worth area, and they do consumer analytics and market segmentation. So what they would do is they would figure out which one of the 71 possible psychographic segments of the population is most likely to buy that bag, and then they can tell you everywhere on Earth where people are that fit into the same psychographic profile. Now, the way that they know this is based on all the sorts of information out there that's public, like that we do. Like, what do we watch? What kind of newspapers do we buy? What kind of magazines do we buy? What are we interested in? Where do we travel? What sort of information can they get off wearables and implantables? Where do we shop? What do we buy on mail order? What kind of property and utilities do we buy? Our finances, our insurance, our phones, charity contributions, what kind of cars we buy, our demographic information, which is the most basic, what kind of television we watch, and social media, and also our location. So all of this information is collected and categorized by people. Especially that which is related to our credit card information. And my favorite story about this, and the one that actually made me want to use this type of technique in child maltreatment prevention, was this one. So President Obama was an incredibly effective fundraiser. And the way that they did this is he would have these big fundraising parties at George Clooney's house. They would figure out who was most likely to donate large sums of money. Then they relate that back to the person's address, run a market segmentation, and they figured out that it was women around the age of 50 who had an affinity for celebrity, small dinner, and contests that were most likely to donate large sums of money. Then, once they identify that, they can figure out where these people are located all over the country, and that on the East Coast, Sarah Jessica Parker was the most attractive celebrity to this psychographic profile. And so then they would have contests to win a small dinner at Sarah Jessica Parker's brownstone, and that's where they would do the fundraising event. So they can take this information all the way down to a very specific level. So for example, they can tell you that if you live in the house with the blue dot, that you are, about what age you are, how old your kids are, hold on, I want to read this to you. They can say that you're college graduates, that you have 2 children that are likely to be 13 and 15, you like to watch Law & Order, you dine out 3 times a month, you lease your vehicles, and you shop at Sam's Club. And that is, I mean, each one of these packets is like this thick with information about people. Now, I know that it's really scary. But people are already using this information for political reasons and for corporate reasons. So, for example, on this, the way that politicians use this information is they figure out who has changed voting behaviors in the past. They run a market segmentation and then identify what type of household those people are in, and then they'll go into the very small districts where they need to change votes, and they'll develop messaging very specifically for that psychographic profile. So their campaign managers and their people will say, okay, go to the blue house and say this message. Go to the pink house and say this message. Skip the orange house, they're not going to change their mind. So it's that targeted when it comes to messaging to change people's behavior. So why can't we do that for kids? Why can't we use that for kids? It's not going anywhere, that's for sure. And we're already mostly comfortable with the concept of having market segmentation and consumer analytics influence what we see. For example, I mean, who doesn't love all of the original programming on Netflix, right? They base all of that on how the millions and millions of users interact with Netflix, where you pause, what you click on, what you look at, who you search for, and they develop their original content around that. It's even possible now for online shopping type venues to monitor the way that you use your touchpad or your mouse to figure out what your emotional state is so that they know when to pitch certain products to you based on how you're interfacing with the computer. So again, I know it's scary, but there is no going off the grid. It's not possible. And let me tell you about some of the really positive ways that we can use this for kids. So what about foster and adoption recruitment? We started working with the state, and we did a market segmentation of all of the people that foster children, foster to adopt children, and who adopt children out of one particular adoption agency. And what we found is this type of information. So we identified 2 segments that are likely to foster to adopt children, or I'm sorry, this is just for contracted foster only. And then after you identify the segments, they can give you a dot density of where those households exist in the city. So each one of the dots on this map represents an actual household. Now, it doesn't represent the people in that household, because if someone moves out of that house, someone with similar psychographic characteristics is likely to move back in. So it's location-based, not person-based. But they can sell you this list, obviously, so then you can do whatever kind of marketing you want to do. So for contracted foster placement only, what we found very interesting in this analysis was that if you want to recruit foster and adoptive families, first, you can see where to go. I mean, it gives you a very discrete area of, okay, this is the place where these people live. But we found that if the spokesperson that would be most effective is an NBA basketball star or maybe a college basketball star, that if we're trying to reach these people, that we want to recruit at a health club, not at a church, and that the event that would be most likely to bring them out is a tailgating event. So it's that type of information that consumer analytics can give us. And you can do the same with adoption recruitment. So what we did is we took those very high-risk block groups and we determined what the dominant household type is in each one of those block groups. Because while demographically these block groups are very similar, psychographically they're completely different. So the way that you're going to approach introducing a new concept in these areas is going to be very different based on the people that live there. And this is how we hope to address things like corporal punishment, which is what leads to domestic violence and a lot of the other violence that we see. That's a deep-seated cultural norm that we know is damaging to children, and through this information we're hoping to gain the kind of traction that is necessary to actually change the social norm. Another thing you can do with this information is drive economic development, because if you know what type of work the psychographic profile in those neighborhoods can do, which the profile tells you, then you can look at the types of jobs that the people that are there are capable of doing versus the types of jobs that are actually available there, and start to match them up to bring economic development to the areas. Because if you know where they like to eat and where they like to shop, you can just look in that area and see, do they have that store there? And if they don't, you put a store there and you're bringing economic development to the community. So here's where children's hospitals come in. So I know I only have like 5 minutes left, and it's going to be hard to get through this in 5 minutes, but we're going to try. So most of this is, you probably look at this and you think, yeah, but what does this have to do with primary care or with medical care or with hospital systems? But we actually play a vital role going forward, and let me show you why. So Tarrant County has one of the highest levels of child abuse and neglect in Texas, and we also have one of the highest infant mortality rates. But until we started doing these mapping projects, we didn't see how they related to each other. So if you look at the city of Fort Worth, this is a heat map of substantiated child maltreatment cases. This is where the violence is happening. If you look at causes of child death, all causes, medical causes, suicide, gun violence, gang violence, whatever kind of death you can think of, this is how they are distributed in the city. And if you look at sudden unexpected infant death, this is where it's distributed in the city. So everything is happening right here. And it's not necessarily in the areas where you would expect, because these areas don't necessarily overlap with where poverty is. So this map shows you in the white areas where the most concentrated extreme poverty exists in the city, and the dark blue areas are the more wealthy areas. So you wouldn't necessarily put your resources in these places if you were basing your decisions only on poverty. So what we learned here is that we're looking at child maltreatment and infant mortality in exactly the same area. And so we asked the question, well, are people that are going into this area to provide services, are they telling these people the same thing? Are they getting consistent messaging about infant mortality and infant care and child maltreatment, or are they getting different messages? And of course we learned that they were getting very different messages. But it makes sense that these things would overlap because risk factors for child maltreatment overlap those for infant mortality, and the toxic stress outcomes from child maltreatment overlap those risk factors for fetal death and prematurity. But the disconnect was that we had an infant mortality review team looking at the medical causes of infant death, and we had a child fatality review team looking at the injury-related causes of infant death. So what we ended up with was two teams, essentially. One, which was part of all of the big hospital systems where the birthing facilities were, promoting breastfeeding and promoting bed sharing for breastfeeding. But what they didn't know is that in the other committee, they were looking at all of the suffocation-related infant mortality. And so what they were doing is going into the same environment and giving completely opposite messages. One group is saying bed share with your baby. Meanwhile, that group doesn't know that the bed sharing is what's causing a lot of the infant mortality. So we started a project to, instead of separating these issues out into different categories that different types of people and different organizations work on, we've been working on streamlining them into a more central location. So what we did with this information is we developed a collaboration in our city with all of the birthing hospitals. We learned quickly that because the birthing hospitals had been attending the fetal review team meetings, that they were not aware of suffocation as a risk factor, and they were not consistently teaching safe infant sleep practices in the hospitals. So we all changed our policies to the same policy. We all created a single campaign strategy, campaign messaging that we co-branded, which is kind of amazing because these are competing birthing hospitals in one city. All of the staff in all of the hospitals was trained. We bought sleep sacks, moved away from swaddling. So, I mean, we made a really big effort to change the context in the city so that no matter where the people from this very high-risk area go, they're going to hear the same message that you need to breastfeed and practice safe infant sleep. And the next step of this in infant mortality reduction is kind of inspired by the project in Finland where they gave baby boxes to everybody. This is a baby box. It's a cardboard bassinet, essentially, and we're working on giving these away universally for free to all deliveries in the city of Fort Worth for a period of 2 years to raise awareness around the topic of infant mortality, and also as a delivery method to share information about positive parenting techniques and drowning prevention. Some programs even include things like trigger guards in these boxes. And all of the campaign material, if you guys are interested in that, is also available on our website. Everything's free. We're now working in Texas to develop the No-Hit Zone, which is an anti-corporal punishment project across all of the children's hospitals in Texas to roll out a statewide launch of the concept in April, which is Child Abuse Prevention Month in 2017. So this is additional collaborative work. And then we're also trying to norm healthy outcomes through a social norming campaign called Survivors Like Me, where we've been interviewing people that have been through terrible things and have come out on the other side, not to talk about the terrible thing that happened to them or how great their life is now, but how they made the transition, because that's something that you don't hear a lot about, and when people are lost, that's what they're looking for. So I could keep going, but I'll stop there. Does anyone have any questions? I think we have 2 or 3 minutes. Sure.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm the chief of surgery, and not a week goes by that we don't see 1 or 2 severely traumatized victims from child abuse. Our trauma team, under Jen Fritzstein's direction, has taken this on with much enthusiasm and passion. And we're way behind you. We're actually just doing the analysis now to try and identify the heat map of the greater Washington area. My question to you is, with all that you've done, have you actually impacted the number of admissions for child abuse to your hospital?
Not yet. But I would expect that as the education and the programs are underway, that will probably have an increased number of children being reported to CPS. So it will probably at first appear that there are more. But I don't expect to see a reduction until we get cure violence out into these areas. I'm hoping that that will be the thing that makes a difference. But as for the maps, we've created maps like this for all of the major cities in Texas, because we're working with the Texas Advanced Computing Center, which is, they have the fastest supercomputer in the world, or they've got a grant to build the fastest supercomputer in the world. And so we're developing maps like this and psychographic profiles and risk terrain modeling for big cities in Texas, and that's something that we can expand. And it's not something we're charging for, but it's something that we can expand out to other cities so that we can all work together on figuring out how to impact reducing the number of kids coming in, because right now no one knows how to do that.
Thank you. This was very informative. I really appreciate it. As a corollary to Tony's question, even if you can't measure sort of the impact as it relates to the number of kids that are admitted, how do you measure the impact for some of those initiatives so that you can say, well, this initiative did this?
That's what I was going to talk about, but then I ran out of time. So another thing that children's hospitals have that is very unique to children's hospitals, and why I think it's important for us to be leaders in this going forward, is HIPAA. You probably didn't think I was going to say that, right? But we have the infrastructure to protect information in a way that social services, they don't have that. They don't have the capability of protecting information the way that we can. And so what we have the ability to do because of that is to monitor objective measurements of child well-being, not only at an individual level, but at a block group level. And there are all sorts of things that you can track at a block group level to see what is changing as we move toward trying to reduce the actual number of substantiated child maltreatment cases. And so what we're working on now is figuring out a way to get all of these objective factors, and many more, but we're trying to pare it down, out of all of these state systems, because that's where they live. Each one of these systems has a different, I mean, they don't even share with each other. I mean, they can't even share information with each other. And so, and I don't know if that's true here, but that's how it works in Texas. And so that's why we started working with the Texas Advanced Computing Center, because they can develop really a fusion center for us, which is the goal, a goal going forward, where we can gather information that's relevant to knowing if a child is actually doing better or not in one place to inform not only prevention work, but also what happens after you intervene, what a quality foster family looks like, how to engineer the outcomes for children that we actually want, instead of continuing to talk about all the bad things that are happening. And the way that I know that this is possible is I went and visited the Fort Worth True Crime Center, Real-Time Crime Center, and they told me that when someone is doing a car chase, they have in their real-time crime centers, they can tell you every human that has ever owned that car, every address that's ever been associated with, all known associates of the driver, every name they've ever been under, every family member they've ever had, all sorts of other stuff. And so and what they do with this information in real time is if they're chasing someone down the freeway and the person gets off the freeway, they know that someone is not going to do a car chase in an area that they're not familiar with. So they start searching that area for known associates, and then they wait for the person there, and then when the person shows up, they avoid the shootout because they intersect. They do that in real time. And we can't even figure out for foster kids what their medical diagnoses are when they show up, 30 minutes before surgery, right? And so there has to be a better way to do this. And so we've been working on, with the Texas Advanced Computing Center, finding a way to get all of the relevant points of information that exist across all of the data systems in one place so that we can actually start focusing on the child instead of focusing on the system.
Well, this was just fantastic. So
thank you.
Just really, really want to thank you for coming all the way from Texas to share with us. And I think we are really at an inflection point, and the information that you provided for us really is going to give us great food for thought on what we can continue to do. There's great work going on in the community, but how we continue to break down the barriers. I think, we have Lieutenant Augustine here today, the great work that you're doing to support us and our community, but also the work that we need to do with the Department of Mental Health, and think about this in a very, very different way. It was really informative. And the work that we have yet to do internally, just with our screening and bringing our education and our knowledge base up to speed with all of our medical teams. So it was really, really outstanding, and we look forward to this ongoing partnership because this just opened the door, I think, for us to have you back at a future time. So thank you so much. And please, we're going to continue the conversation in the Innovation Center for those of you who want to join us for light breakfast and refreshments and continue the conversation.